Thank you, President. And I'm pleased to rise to speak to the Assisted Reproductive Treatment Amendment Consent Bill 2019. And I must say, I don't think it was something I was really planning to speak on or to be involved in. And oddly enough, it was my interest in this bill was drawn out of the inquiry into the spent convictions inquiry that's being undertaken by the Legal and Social Issues Committee, and we'll get on to that in a moment. But this bill does meet the recommendation 4 of the Gorton Review, which recognised that married women are discriminated against, and married women within the Reproductive Treatment Act are treated differently to single women and women in de facto relationships or women leaving de facto relationships, that specifically women separating from marriage are treated differently, and this bill goes to rectify that, and I think that that is commendable. I do, and I think it's a very outdated provision. It has that notion that that the man still has control over the woman's body, and so I don't think there's anyone here in this chamber who would disagree with this. And I do understand that in some circumstances this refusal of consent has been around family violence and has been around male domination, which has been some of the reasons why these women have separated and have left their marriage. And as previous speakers has mentioned, that this was highlighted in the federal court decision EHT 18 versus Melbourne IVF last year, and it also that case also found that this provision was inconsistent with the Commonwealth Sex Discrimination Act, but only ruled on that specific case, did not broaden their ruling to say that all married women in a situation of separation could rely on this decision. So I think in this context, I'm pleased that the government is moving swiftly on this matter, and anecdotally I am aware of 6 or 7 women who are currently being negatively affected by the provision right now. So I'm pleased that we can act quickly in this parliament today to assist them. And looking at some of the issues that were raised by the sector in a letter that was sent to us last month, I think the bill, and I certainly, in my eyes, the response from the Minister's office to the questions that SARC raised go a long way to answering the concerns of the sector. I think it's also important to note that this is a recommendation from the Gorton Review, which actually consulted with the sector very broadly. So I don't think this should come as any surprise. I suspect there is some disappointment in the sector that they're not seeing all of the Gorton Review implemented probably as swiftly as they would like, because as the Gorton Review found, it's in need. This legislation is in desperate need of renovation, and that it's not really, as they would say, it's not particularly fit for purpose. But I've spoken to the Minister about this, and she assures me that there is a tranche of reforms that will be coming through shortly and quickly to really meet a lot of the issues that were raised in the Gorton Review. But one issue, and the issue that certainly piqued my interest in this from a personal and a professional perspective, was the use of police checks and working with children checks as part of the application process for accessing IVF. And we know that this brings, it's a very stressful time for families undertaking IVF, and this added just another absolute level of stress. And while the Gorton Review said that this was outside the scope of their review, they made note, and I'd just like to quickly quote a section from the review when looking at presumptions against treatment. In terms of presumptions against treatment, many responses to the review's consultations suggested that Victoria's system of conducting police and child protection checks for all people undergoing ART and establishing a presumption against treatment should be reconsidered. As reported in the review's interim report, this requirement received more comments during public consultations and the survey conducted in 2018 than any other issue. So this was the biggest concern. During the Gorton Review, those police checks had the highest concern of any other issue, probably equal to cost. In later consultations with stakeholders, including clinics, patients and service providers, this issue continued to be raised. The review has heard many reports of the cost, the burden, the delay and the distress caused by this requirement. And then the review went on to say that the review has not heard any evidence of the effectiveness of this system in preventing the abuse of children. The system could be dismantled without creating significant risk to children or revised to better target the risks of family violence and the risks to children. And this would be welcomed. Now, I thought that this was a perfect vehicle to meet those concerns and to finally put to rest this burdensome and unnecessary regulatory loop, regulatory hurdle that that families and women are having to undertake. But I think this is absolutely urgent. And while we know that allowing separated women to access ART now is also urgent, and we know it's a time game. Time is of the essence in these circumstances. So any barriers and anything that causes delays should be, as much as we possibly can, reviewed. And certainly I was talking to someone who was talking about women with cancer having to urgently freeze their eggs before they could undertake treatment. Now, as they now have to wait for a police check and a working with children check before they can do this, this adds an extraordinary amount of stress. So I have formulated an amendment which would remove this discriminatory requirement under the Act, because I think it's an important one. And I'm wondering if that amendment could just be circulated quickly now. Thank you, Acting President. Thank you, President. Thank you, Dr. Cumming. So while that's being distributed, obviously I've clarified what that amendment is. I am today, the Minister presented me with documentation that they have now put out a review process to consider this. Now, I guess I'm an impatient person, and I suspect most of the people on IVF are impatient people too. Or not impatient, they've probably been working very patiently towards conceiving. But when they are undertaking IVF, every second, every minute, every hour can matter. So I do think that this is an urgent reform. I'm encouraged that the Minister has sent out a background paper with an option for removing this requirement. I have to say, in going back and looking at the Gorton Review, I think it's very clear what the sector has to say about this, and while it might have been outside the scope of the review, it was the most common issue that was raised in that review. So I do look, I think I'll accept that the minister is doing this and accept that her proposal that is in response to the feedback that was received in the Gorton review, that the government is now considering removing this requirement for police and children and child protection checks as a precondition to accessing assisted reproductive treatment. I accept that, and I look forward to hearing the minister make some assurances on the floor about how that process will happen, because, as I mentioned, with women with cancer, with women, very often we know women do access IVF later in life when they've realised that other options have failed them or have not come to pass. So we know that all burdens and all things that delay the process, delay that person undertaking treatment, just make it more difficult. So I look forward to seeing further amendments. I look forward to seeing this Act being renovated and this program being renovated wholeheartedly as in line with, I think, some of the very sensible suggestions from the Gorton review. And apart from that, I'm happy to lend my support to the bill.